The sharp metallic tang of violence still clung to his tailored trousers, right where a sticky 2-year-old hand now clamped hard. Damien despised children, loud, unpredictable liabilities. But as the exhausted boy slumped heavily against his chest, the ruthless syndicate boss felt something entirely unwelcome. A pulse. Baseboards were the enemy. Zoe felt the familiar, dull burn radiating through her lower back as she dragged the damp microfiber cloth along the seamless oak trim. The penthouse was a sprawling, sterile monument to cold money. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the grey, rain-slicked sprawl of the city, filtering in a pale, bruised light. There were no photos on the walls, no loose mail on the counters, just sharp architectural angles, imported Italian leather, and the lingering clinical scent of ozone from the high-end air purifiers humming in the corners. She plunged her cracked hands back into the plastic bucket of diluted ammonia. The water had gone lukewarm and murky. Her skin felt tight, stripped of oils by hours of scrubbing, smelling faintly of cheap lemon soap and the harsh chemicals she used to erase other people's messes. She was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep, marrow-sucking exhaustion that made her vision swim if she stood up too fast. Behind her, a soft, wet cough broke the absolute silence of the apartment. Zoe swallowed a sigh and glanced over her shoulder. Toby sat on the center of the Persian rug, a hand-woven masterpiece that likely cost more than her combined rent for the next 5 years. He was gnawing rhythmically on a plastic teething ring shaped like a turtle. He was 2 years old, running a low-grade fever that had gotten him banned from the community center daycare that morning, and he was the only reason Zoe hadn't thrown herself off a bridge yet. "Keep it down, Bug," she whispered, her voice gravelly. "Mama's almost done." Toby blinked at her, his dark eyes glossy with fever. His chest rattled slightly as he breathed. He wasn't crying, just radiating that pathetic, lethargic heat that made Zoe's chest tight with guilt. She shouldn't have brought him here. It was a flagrant violation of the agency's strictest rule. But her neighbor hadn't answered the door. Her sister was working a double shift at the diner, and missing this cleaning meant missing the electricity bill. She had gambled on the schedule. Mr. Kim, the ghost who owned this penthouse, was notoriously absent during daylight hours. The agency said he worked in logistics and never returned before midnight. 50 floors below, Damien stepped into the private elevator. His tie was already loose, the silk knot yanked down by a thumb that was currently bruised black and split at the knuckle. The enclosed steel box smelled immediately of him. Expensive, smoky scotch, the metallic tang of dry-cleaning solvent, and the sharp, undeniable copper scent of arterial blood. He stared at his reflection in the mirrored doors. His eyes were hollow, flanked by shadows so dark they looked bruised. He didn't look like a man who had just secured a vital shipping route for the largest organized crime syndicate on the coast. He looked like a corpse that had been forced to wear a $5,000 suit. Damien wanted darkness. He wanted a heavy pour of lagavolin and 3 hours of dreamless, chemically induced sleep before his burner phone started vibrating again. His life was an exercise in absolute, suffocating control. He dictated who breathed, who bled, and who profited in 3 different area codes. His apartment was the one place where variables did not exist. No surprises, no noise, just the hum of the air purifier and the cold city lights. The elevator chimed softly. The steel doors slid apart. Damien stepped into his foyer and stopped dead. There was a bucket in the hallway, a bright, neon-yellow plastic bucket. It sat on his imported slate tiles, surrounded by a faint puddle of sudsy water. It was an aesthetic violation so profound it made his jaw clench. He stepped past it, the leather soles of his Oxfords silent on the stone, his hand instinctively ghosting toward the heavy weight of the Glock holstered at his hip. He rounded the corner into the main living space. Zoe froze. The sound of the elevator had been a physical blow, a sudden drop in cabin pressure that left her gasping. She was caught on her hands and knees, half crawling toward the coffee table. Her heart slammed against her ribs with the violence of a trapped bird. She scrambled upright, her wet sneakers slipping on the hardwood, kicking the bucket back just enough to slosh dirty water onto the baseboards she had just cleaned. Panic tasted like old pennies in her mouth. Damien stood in the entryway. He was tall, perfectly tailored, and terrifyingly still. The sleeves of his suit jacket were slightly damp. He didn't look at her face. His dead, obsidian eyes swept the room, assessing threats. Then he saw the mass on the rug. Toby had dropped his teething ring. He was sitting in a pair of miniature denim overalls, staring up at the stranger with wide, unbothered eyes. Damien blinked. It was a child. Damien hated children. The aversion wasn't born of some tragic, suppressed trauma. It was purely practical. Children were chaos vectors. They screamed, they leaked fluids, they broke things, and they fundamentally lacked reason. They were unpredictable liabilities in a world where unpredictability got you shot in the back of the head. "Why is there a child in my house?" Damien's voice was flat. It wasn't a yell. The quiet, lethal calmness of it made the hair on the back of Zoe's neck stand up. Zoe moved purely on instinct. She lunged across the rug, scooping Toby up into her arms and pressing his fever-warm face against her collarbone. Toby let out a startled, irritated whine, pushing his sticky hands against her neck, but she clamped him tight. She was a black woman in a city that barely acknowledged her existence, standing in the private sanctuary of a man who could likely make her disappear with a single phone call. She wasn't stupid. She knew the rumors. You didn't clean for Damien Kim without hearing the terrified whispers in the agency break room. Don't touch his desk. Don't look in the spare bedroom. Don't ask questions. "My daycare fell through, Mr. Kim," Zoe said. Her voice shook, an embarrassing tremor she couldn't suppress, but she forced her chin up. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "He has a fever. They wouldn't take him. I couldn't leave him alone, and I needed this shift. I kept him quiet. I'm almost done." Damien didn't say anything. He slowly shrugged off his suit jacket, tossing it over the back of a white leather chair. He pinched the bridge of his nose, closing his eyes as a dull, jagged throb pulsed behind his left temple. He was too tired for this. He was too tired to deal with the sheer, mundane humanity of a desperate maid and her sick kid. He opened his eyes and looked at her. Really looked at her. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy, utilitarian knot, escaping in frizzy halos around her temples. Sweat shone on her dark forehead. Her hands, gripping the boy, were white-knuckled, the knuckles cracked and raw from cheap bleach. She looked like she was preparing to take a bullet for the kid. It annoyed him. He didn't care about her struggles. Everyone in this rotten city struggled. He just wanted his silence back. "Get him out," Damien said, turning his back on her and walking towards the wet bar. The sound of crystal clinking against glass was sharp in the quiet room. "Leave the floor, take your bucket and go." Relief washed over Zoe so violently, her knees actually buckled a fraction of an inch. She wasn't fired. She wasn't dead. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I'll just grab my supplies. She loosened her grip to adjust Toby's weight. It was a mistake. Toby, furious at being squeezed and cranky from the fever, arched his back with surprising, slippery strength. He wriggled through Zoe's tired arms, his light-up sneakers hitting the hardwood floor with a soft squeak. "Toby, no!" Zoe hissed, diving for him. But the boy was already moving. His unsteady, drunken sailor run took him directly toward the tallest, most interesting object in the room, the man pouring brown water into a shiny glass. Damien froze, the heavy crystal decanter half tilted in his hand. The toddler slammed into his shins. The physical impact was negligible, barely a brush of fabric, but the psychological violation was immense. Toby wrapped two chubby, saliva-slicked hands around Damien's left leg, anchoring himself right over the pristine, charcoal-grey worsted wool. Damien looked down, a shock of tight, dark curls, a face smeared with what looked like dried apple juice and snot. "Remove it," Damien said softly. His knuckles turned stark white on the decanter. Zoe was there in a second, her hands scrambling to detach her son's tiny fingers from the fabric. But Toby shrieked, a high, piercing, glass-shattering sound that made Damien actually flinch. The noise was a physical assault. Toby buried his hot face into Damien's leg, hiding from his mother's grabbing hands, crying in earnest now. The fever made him clingy, irrational, and desperate for an anchor. I'm so sorry, let go, Toby. Please, Zoe gasped, pulling at Toby's waist. She was crying now, silent tears of sheer frustration and terror leaking over her lashes. She was yanking him, but the kid had a death grip on the crease of the trousers. Damien looked at the woman on her knees. The terror radiating off her was palpable. It smelled like sour sweat and panic. He looked down at the boy clinging to him. The kid was a furnace. Damien could feel the intense, unnatural heat radiating right through his trousers, pressing into his calf. It was a bizarre sensation. Life. Unfiltered, messy, burning life, pressed against a leg that had kicked a man's teeth down his throat barely 6 hours ago. Toby suddenly let go of the leg. He tilted his head back, his face red and wet with tears, and reached up. Both arms raised high in the air, fingers opening and closing in the universal, demanding gesture of a toddler wanting to be picked up. He was looking right at Damien. He wasn't looking at the shadow of violence in the man's posture. He wasn't looking at the faint smear of someone else's blood on the cuff of the white dress shirt. He just saw a tall, solid structure, and he wanted to be held by it. Damien didn't know what possessed him. Maybe it was the blood loss. Maybe it was the sheer hallucinatory exhaustion. Maybe it was the absolute absurdity of a 2-year-old demanding comfort from a monster. He set the decanter down on the marble counter. The clack echoed loudly. "Stop pulling him, you're going to dislocate his shoulder," Damien muttered, his voice gravelly. He bent down, his knees popped. He placed 2 large, calloused hands under the boy's armpits. The kid was heavier than he expected. Dense, solid. Damien stood up, lifting the boy awkwardly, holding him out at arm's length like an unexploded bomb. Toby didn't care about the stiff, uncomfortable grip. The toddler immediately went limp. His heavy, feverish head dropped forward, bypassing Damien's defensive posture, and rested heavily against the hollow of the man's collarbone. Right over the erratic, tightly suppressed thud of the syndicate boss's heart. Damien's entire body went rigid, his spine locked. The boy smelled terrible. He smelled like sour milk, artificial strawberry flavoring, and stale sweat. It was gross. It was entirely human. Zoe knelt on the floor, paralyzed, her hands hovering uselessly in the air, her breath caught in her throat. She watched the most dangerous man in the city freeze, with her son pressed against his chest. Damien looked down at the mop of curls tucked under his chin. The crying had stopped instantly. The heavy, rhythmic, rattling breathing of a sick, exhausted child began, puffing warm air against Damien's throat. The tiny, fragile chest rose and fell against his own, sinking to a rhythm Damien hadn't felt in decades. The sticky hands clutched the lapels of his ruined shirt. For the first time in his adult life, Damien Kim didn't know what to do with his hands. He stood in the middle of his sterile penthouse, surrounded by the smell of ammonia and violence, holding a sleeping kid. Slowly, hesitantly, as if touching a live wire, he brought one large hand up and rested the palm flat against the boy's warm back. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, broken only by the wet, rattling breaths of the 2-year-old. Damien stood frozen in the center of the living room. The kid, Toby, was a dead weight against his chest, a furnace of feverish heat seeping through the ruined white cotton of Damien's dress shirt. His left hand remained splayed flat against the boy's back. He could feel the fragile, bird-like ridge of the child's spine. It felt entirely too easy to snap. That thought alone made Damien's stomach turn with a sour, unfamiliar revulsion. He lived in a world of breaking bones, but this fragility was alien. Zoe hadn't moved. She was still kneeling on the hardwood, her wet sneakers squeaking faintly as she shifted her weight. Her eyes darted from Damien's face to the heavy bulge of the shoulder holster visible beneath his left arm. The Glock 19. It pressed dangerously close to Toby's cheek. "Mr. Kim," Zoe croaked. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. She swallowed hard, tasting bile and adrenaline. "Sir, the gun. It's hard. It's pressing into his face." Damien blinked. He looked down. The black polymer grip of the firearm was indeed resting an inch from the boy's smushed, flushed cheek. Damien shifted his weight, slowly, with deliberate, telegraphed movements, so as not to spook the terrified woman on the floor. He reached across his body with his free hand. He unclipped the holster, pulling the weapon free. He didn't look at it. He walked to the marble kitchen island, his leather shoes silent on the rug, and set the gun down next to the crystal decanter. The heavy thud of metal on stone made Zoe flinch. Damien turned back. He was still holding the kid. He didn't know how to put him down. If he dropped him on the couch, the kid might wake up and start that eardrum-shattering screaming again. The thought of that noise echoing through his sterile, quiet sanctuary was unbearable. "Does he have medication?" Damien asked. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It didn't sound like him. It sounded like a man who hadn't spoken in days. Zoe scrambled to her feet. Her knees popped loudly in the quiet room. "Yes, in my bag. Children's ibuprofen, but it's cherry-flavored. He hates the cherry flavor. He spits it out." "Get it," Damien ordered. He walked slowly toward the massive, white leather sectional that dominated the center of the room. He sat down. The leather creaked in protest beneath his weight. Toby shifted, a small whine escaping his parted lips, but he didn't wake. He just burrowed deeper, his drool soaking a fresh patch of Damien's shirt. Damien leaned back against the cushions, letting the boy rest fully on his chest. Zoe practically sprinted to the entryway. She dug frantically through her battered canvas tote bag. her cracked fingers scraping against loose change, crumpled receipts, and half-empty packs of cheap wet wipes. She found the sticky plastic bottle and the plastic oral syringe. When she walked back into the living room, the sight made her breath hitch. Damien Kim, the man rumoured to have drowned a rival boss in the harbour last month, was sitting on his couch with a sleeping toddler draped over him. Damien's head was tipped back, his dark eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. One large hand rested protectively over the boy's back, rising and falling with Toby's laboured breathing. The stark white of Damien's shirt was smeared with dirt and saliva. "Draw it up," Damien said, not taking his eyes off the ceiling. Zoe uncapped the bottle. The cloying, artificial smell of medicinal cherry filled the air, fighting against the underlying scent of Damien's expensive scotch and the copper tang of blood. She pulled the plunger back, measuring the pink liquid to the correct line. "I have to wake him up," Zoe said, her voice shaking again. "He might cry. I'm sorry." Damien finally lowered his chin and looked at her. "Just do it." Zoe stepped closer. She could smell Damien now. It wasn't just the alcohol. It was the sharp, metallic odour of adrenaline, and a faint, stale sweat that spoke of a very long, very bad day. She reached out, her fingers brushing the dark curls on Toby's head. "Toby, Bug, wake up, medicine time." Toby groaned. He squeezed his eyes shut tighter, twisting his face into Damien's chest to hide from the voice. "Hey," Damien said. His voice was low, a deep rumble that vibrated through his chest cavity. Toby felt it. The boy's eyes fluttered open. They were glassy and red-rimmed. "Open," Zoe said, bringing the syringe to his mouth. Toby saw the pink liquid and immediately clamped his mouth shut. He shook his head aggressively, smacking his face against Damien's collarbone. "No!" he whined, his voice thick with sleep and mucus. "If he doesn't take it, his fever stays high," Zoe said, panic rising again. "I usually have to hold his arms down." Damien sighed, a long bone-deep exhale. He shifted his grip, moving his large hands to gently but firmly bracket the sides of Toby's head. It wasn't a violent hold, but it was an immovable one. Toby couldn't twist away. "Kid," Damien said. Toby stopped squirming. He looked up at the stranger holding his head. "Open your mouth and swallow the trash, or I put you on the floor," Damien said. The tone was completely flat, deadpan. He didn't use a baby voice. He spoke to the 2-year-old the exact same way he spoke to his lieutenants when they missed a shipment. Toby stared at him. Then, slowly, his lower lip trembled and his mouth parted. Zoe didn't waste the opening. She slipped the syringe past his lips and pushed the plunger. Toby gagged at the cherry taste, his face scrunching up in disgust. He looked like he was going to spit it right onto Damien's shirt. "Swallow it," Damien commanded softly. Toby swallowed. He let out a loud, pathetic sob, then immediately dropped his forehead back against Damien's chest, hiding his face again. Zoe stepped back, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the empty syringe. Thank you. Thank you." Damien didn't respond. He just stared at the wall over her shoulder. The adrenaline was leaving his system, replaced by a crushing, leaden exhaustion. The throbbing in his temple had spread to the base of his skull, but the heat radiating from the boy on his chest was strangely grounding. It was a singular, physical reality in a day that had been defined by abstract violence and corporate body counts. "Clean the baseboards," Damien muttered, closing his eyes. And don't make a sound." Zoe nodded frantically. "Yes, sir." For the next hour, the only sounds in the penthouse were the rhythmic hiss of Zoe's damp cloth against the woodwork, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and the soft, wheezing breaths of the sleeping toddler. Zoe worked with frantic, meticulous precision. She scrubbed until her fingernails throbbed, and the cheap lemon soap burned into the micro-cuts on her palms. Every few minutes, she threw a terrified glance toward the living room. Damien hadn't moved. He remained on the couch, entirely motionless, his breathing slow and even. Toby was completely passed out, his fever finally breaking thanks to the ibuprofen, leaving him sweaty and limp against the mobster's chest. It was a deeply unnatural tableau. The tailored suit, the loaded gun on the counter, the blood on the cuffs, and the sleeping black child tucked under the man's chin. Zoe felt a bizarre, hysterical laugh bubbling in the back of her throat, but she bit her lip until she tasted copper to suppress it. Finally, she wrung out her cloth for the last time. The water in her bucket was black. The baseboards gleamed. The apartment smelled of sterile lemon and ozone again. She stood up slowly, her lower back screaming in protest. She walked into the kitchen, emptied the bucket down the sink, and rinsed it out. She dried her cracked hands on a paper towel. It was time to leave. It was time to wake the dragon and get her son back. Zoe walked into the living room and stopped a few feet from the couch. "Mr. Kim," she whispered. Damien's eyes snapped open. There was no grogginess, no slow transition from sleep to wakefulness. 1 second he was asleep. The next, his eyes were dark, alert, and tracking her movements. It was the waking habit of a man who fully expected to be murdered in his bed. He looked down at the weight on his chest. Toby was drooling profusely, a wet patch spreading across the silk lining of Damien's suit jacket. Damien's jaw clenched. The momentary bizarre peace was over. Reality crashed back in, bringing with it the smell of cheap cleaning supplies and the throbbing headache. "I'm finished, sir," Zoe said. She kept her eyes fixed on his chin. Looking him in the eyes felt too dangerous. "I'll take him now. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Damien didn't say anything. He gripped Toby by the armpits again, lifting the dead weight off his chest. Toby grumbled in his sleep, his arms flailing weakly as the heat source disappeared. But he didn't wake up. Zoe stepped forward and scooped him into her arms. The immediate transfer of heat left Damien's chest feeling strangely cold. He stood up, smoothing the ruined front of his shirt. He looked at the wet patch of drool. He looked at the dirt smeared on his trousers. He should have been furious. He should have called the cleaning agency right now and had the woman fired, blacklisted, and evicted. That was how his world worked. Incompetence and disrespect were met with swift, disproportionate punishment. He walked over to the marble counter and picked up his Glock, checking the safety before sliding it back into the shoulder holster. He opened a drawer next to the oven and pulled out a thick, leather-bound money clip. Zoe watched him, her heart slamming against her ribs again. He was getting his gun. He was getting something from the drawer. She shifted Toby's weight, angling her body so she was between her son and the man in the suit. It was a useless, instinctual defense. Damien walked back to her. He stopped 2 feet away. He was a full head taller than her, casting a long dark shadow in the dimming light of the penthouse. He pulled a thick wad of bills from the clip. They were $100 bills, crisp, sequential, untraceable. He peeled off 5 bills and held them out. Zoe stared at the money. $500. The cleaning agency paid her $80 for this shift, and they took 20% of that. "Take it," Damien said. "Sir, I can't. The agency pays me directly." "The agency takes a cut," Damien interrupted, his voice flat. "I don't pay parasites. Take the money." Zoe hesitated, then slowly reached out with her free hand, her cracked, bleach-burned fingers brushing against the crisp paper. She pulled the money toward her. "Thank you. Thank you. I'll make sure he never comes back. I promise. You'll never see him again." Damien looked at her. He looked at the dark bags under her eyes, the frayed collar of her uniform shirt, and the desperate, protective grip she had on the sleeping child. He looked at the kid, the mop of curls, the face sticky with dry tears and cherry medicine. He thought about the cold, absolute silence of his apartment. He thought about the blood on his knuckles. He thought about the weight of a heartbeat against his chest. "The kid stays quiet," Damien said softly. Zoe blinked, confused. "Sir." "If your daycare falls through again," Damien said, his dead eyes shifting from her face to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the grey city. "He stays in the utility room, and he doesn't touch my legs." Zoe stared at him. The sheer absurdity of the statement short-circuited her exhausted brain. The mafia boss wasn't firing her. He wasn't threatening her. He was giving her permission to bring a toddler back into a sterile penthouse. Yes, sir. Thank you." Damien turned his back on her, walking toward the wet bar to retrieve his glass of scotch. "Get out." Zoe didn't need to be told twice. She clutched the money, adjusted Toby on her hip, grabbed her bucket, and walked out the door. The heavy steel of the private elevator closed behind her, sealing her away from the cold, violent world of the penthouse. In the living room, Damien stood alone. The silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. The air purifier hummed softly in the corner. He took a sip of the scotch. It burned his throat, familiar and sharp. He looked down at his shirt. The white cotton was ruined, stained with dirt, cherry medicine, and the drool of a 2-year-old child. Damien ran a thumb over the damp fabric, right over his heart. The skin beneath it still felt unnaturally warm. He scowled, downed the rest of the scotch in one swallow, and turned off the lights. The dark was where he belonged. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like control. It just felt empty. Damien's empire was built on blood and absolute silence. But a desperate maid and her feverish toddler just fractured his pristine cage. Zoe survived the day, but she's now dangerously tethered to a monster who suddenly remembers what a heartbeat feels like. What happens when the syndicate boss decides he wants more than just clean baseboards? Let me know your thoughts below. If you loved this dark, gritty romance, hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel for more.